women's basketball didn't slowly grow into relevance. It exploded. Almost overnight, the sport went from fighting for attention to competing with the biggest leagues in the world. Arenas that used to have empty seats were suddenly sold out weeks in advance. Ticket prices didn't just rise, they skyrocketed. Television ratings didn't inch upward, they shattered records. And for the first time in its history, the WNBA wasn't begging for visibility. It had leverage. At the center of that shift was one player. A rookie. A name that casual fans, die-hard basketball junkies, and even people who hadn't watched a women's game in their lives suddenly knew. Caitlin Clark didn't just bring attention. She changed behavior. People traveled across states just to watch her play. Secondary ticket markets surged by hundreds of %. Broadcasts featuring her began outperforming games that were supposed to be untouchable. This wasn't hype built by marketing departments or corporate campaigns. It was organic. It was demand. And it came at the exact moment women's basketball needed it most. Then came the Olympics. The one stage designed to introduce stars to the entire world. The one moment every 4 years where basketball transcends leagues, rivalries, and domestic debates. A global audience. A guaranteed spotlight. A platform that can turn great players into international icons. And Caitlin Clark wasn't there. No injury. No suspension. No scandal that forced a last-minute decision. She was simply left off the roster. Quietly. Abruptly. With explanations that sounded reasonable on the surface but collapsed the moment anyone looked closer. At first, people assumed there had to be more to the story. Maybe it was load management. Maybe it was strategy. Maybe it was something happening behind the scenes that fans didn't understand. But as the days passed, that confusion turned into disbelief. And disbelief turned into anger. Because the more the season unfolded, the harder it became to pretend this was just another basketball decision. The league kept saying it wanted to grow the game. Executives kept talking about momentum, opportunity, and a new era. But when the biggest opportunity of all arrived, they pulled back. They chose familiarity over momentum, control over chaos, comfort over risk. And that decision didn't just affect one player. It exposed a fault line that had been quietly forming for years. A clash between the old guard and the new reality. Between a system built on seniority and a marketplace driven by stars. Between protecting what existed and embracing what was possible. What followed wasn't just backlash. It was a reckoning. Fans began asking questions the league wasn't prepared to answer. Media narratives spiraled. Players were dragged into debates they never asked for. And the very people who claimed to be growing the sport suddenly found themselves defending why they refused to showcase its biggest draw. This story isn't really about a roster spot. It's about power. It's about fear. And it's about what happens when an institution finally gets what it's been asking for, and realizes it doesn't know how to handle it. Because when women's basketball finally had the world's attention, the people in charge blinked. And everything that came after made that mistake impossible to hide. Before the Olympic roster was even announced, the numbers were already impossible to ignore. Wherever Caitlin Clark went, the WNBA followed. Teams that struggled to sell tickets suddenly moved games to larger arenas. Road crowds swelled in cities that hadn't shown much interest in women's basketball for years. Prices on the secondary market didn't just increase, they exploded. In some cases, tickets jumped more than 400% simply because her name was on the schedule. Television told the same story. Games featuring Clark weren't just the most watched women's basketball broadcasts of the year. Some of them outperformed major men's sports events in key demographics. A random midweek game featuring the Indiana Fever started pulling numbers that networks usually reserve for playoff matchups. That kind of audience growth doesn't come from clever advertising. It comes from cultural relevance. And the Olympics were built for exactly this kind of moment. For decades, women's basketball has struggled to break through internationally in the same way the men's game has. The talent has always been there, but global stars require visibility. The Olympics offer something no domestic league can replicate: a captive worldwide audience tuning in at the same time. Entire countries discovering players they've never seen before. highlights circulating across continents within minutes. This was the bridge between popularity and permanence. Broadcasters knew it. Sponsors knew it. Even casual observers could see how perfectly the timing lined up. Caitlin Clark arriving at the peak of her momentum, stepping onto the Olympic stage, launching Logo 3s with the world watching. Those clips wouldn't just live on sports pages. They would dominate social feeds. They would introduce women's basketball to millions of people who had never clicked on a WNBA highlight before. Instead, that moment never happened. Team USA still went to Paris with an elite roster. They still won. The basketball itself was high level. But the electricity was missing. The sense that something historic was unfolding never fully arrived. The crowds were solid, not frenzied. The ratings were respectable, not explosive. The gold medal game was watched, but it didn't feel like an event. And that contrast is what made the decision sting even more. Because fans had already seen what happens when Caitlin Clark is in the building. They had seen the chaos, the sellouts, the buzz that turns a regular season game into something that feels like a playoff atmosphere. They had seen how her presence elevated not just her team, but the entire league. Role players got more exposure. Opposing stars gained new fans. Every game became a conversation. The Olympics should have been the ultimate amplification of that effect. Instead, it became the clearest example of a missed opportunity in modern sports. Not because the team failed, but because the moment was squandered. Billions of eyes were available. A ready-made star was in her prime. And the people in charge decided they didn't need her. It's hard to overstate how rare that alignment was. Sports leagues spend decades chasing relevance. They invest millions trying to manufacture stars. Here, the star arrived on her own, carrying an audience that was already engaged, already spending money, already paying attention. And the response wasn't excitement. It was hesitation. What should have been a global coming-out party for women's basketball became a reminder that success doesn't always guarantee acceptance. The golden ticket wasn't lost. It was crumpled up and tossed aside by people who believed the system mattered more than the surge. And that decision would soon demand an explanation. When the backlash started building, USA Basketball moved quickly to get ahead of it. The explanations came out carefully worded and polished, designed to sound logical enough to quiet the noise. This wasn't about popularity. This wasn't about headlines. This was about basketball. About experience. About physicality. About team chemistry. On the surface, those reasons sounded familiar. Safe. Responsible. The kind of language organizations use when they want to appear above the chaos. They emphasized seniority. They talked about veterans who had paid their dues. They framed the roster as a finished product that didn't have room for experimentation. But the more people listened, the less sense it made. Caitlin Clark wasn't being asked to carry the team. She wasn't being positioned as the centerpiece. She wasn't expected to take shots away from established stars. This was about the final roster spot. The 12th player. A role that, historically, has often gone to younger players gaining experience for the future. That's where the logic started to crack. Because the idea that the most productive and watched player in the sport wasn't capable of contributing in a limited role didn't match reality. She was already thriving against elite competition. She was already facing the most aggressive defensive schemes in the league every night. Teams were building entire game plans around stopping her, and she was still producing. The physicality argument felt especially hollow. Clark had been hit, grabbed, bumped, and pressured since the opening tip of her professional career. She didn't shrink from it. She adjusted. She adapted. She responded by making teammates better and drawing even more attention from defenses. Then there was the experience argument. The suggestion that she needed more time, more seasoning, more proof. Yet the same system has repeatedly fast-tracked young talent on the men's side. When a generational player emerges, experience suddenly becomes flexible. Youth becomes an asset. Potential becomes a priority. That standard simply didn't apply here. The chemistry argument was the final shield. The idea that bringing in a player with massive attention could disrupt the locker room. that her presence would somehow become a distraction. But this was international competition at the highest level. These were professionals, superstars, players with endorsements, championships, and years of media scrutiny behind them. Suggesting they couldn't coexist with a rookie's spotlight felt less like protection and more like an excuse. Fans weren't buying it. Analysts weren't buying it. And the numbers refused to cooperate. Because while officials were downplaying Clark's impact, the league itself was benefiting from it in real time. Ratings were up. Revenue was rising. Media interest had never been higher. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. If she wasn't good enough for the Olympic team, why was she good enough to drive the league's biggest financial surge in decades? If she wasn't ready, why was she already reshaping the sport's visibility? If experience mattered more than impact, why did the league suddenly feel different the moment she arrived? Those questions didn't go away. And soon, the answers coming from inside the room would make the official story look even weaker. The narrative started to unravel when information began surfacing from people who weren't guessing. These weren't anonymous accounts chasing clicks or fans venting online. They were longtime reporters and insiders with reputations built on accuracy. And what they described painted a very different picture of how the decision was actually made. According to those reports, the concern inside the selection room had little to do with Caitlin Clark's ability. Her skill level was never the real debate. The issue wasn't whether she could help the team win. It was whether the organization wanted to deal with everything that came with her. Her presence wasn't viewed as an advantage. It was viewed as a problem to manage. The fear centered on attention, on noise, on what would happen if Clark didn't get enough minutes. There was genuine anxiety that her fanbase would react loudly if she spent long stretches on the bench. That social media would erupt. That every rotation decision would become a headline. That the focus would shift away from the veterans who had been part of the program for years. Instead of seeing that attention as fuel, it was treated like a threat. The idea that a national team would make roster decisions based on potential backlash was stunning. This wasn't about avoiding controversy related to performance or behavior. This was about avoiding conversation, avoiding expectations, avoiding the pressure that comes with being relevant. In other words, they didn't want the circus. And that fear revealed something deeper. Caitlin Clark's popularity disrupted the existing hierarchy. She arrived without asking permission, without waiting her turn, without fitting neatly into the established pecking order. Her influence didn't come from years in the system. It came from fans, from ratings, from demand. That kind of power doesn't sit comfortably inside traditional structures. Instead of asking how to integrate her, the instinct was to minimize the disruption, to keep things predictable, to preserve control. It was easier to leave her out than to confront what her inclusion represented. What makes this even more striking is how backward the logic was. In most sports organizations, attention is the goal. Exposure is the prize. Managing hype is part of the job. But here, the leadership treated visibility as a liability. They weren't afraid of losing games. They were afraid of losing control of the narrative. And once that became clear, the Olympic snub stopped looking like a basketball decision entirely. It looked like an institutional reflex, a system protecting itself from change. That mindset wouldn't just affect one roster. It would echo throughout the league in ways that became impossible to ignore. The tension didn't begin with the Olympic roster. It had been building long before Caitlin Clark ever stepped onto a professional court. Her rise forced an uncomfortable question that many within the sport weren't ready to answer. What happens when the next generation skips the line? Women's basketball has always valued sacrifice. Long overseas seasons. Years of grinding without recognition. Playing for the love of the game while waiting for infrastructure, pay, and visibility to catch up. For many veterans, that struggle is a badge of honor. It's part of their identity. Clark's arrival disrupted that narrative. She didn't come through the same path. She didn't need years abroad to build a following. She didn't wait for the league to elevate her. She brought her audience with her. And that sudden shift created friction that no press release could smooth over. You could hear it in the tone of certain comments. Warnings disguised as advice. Praise laced with skepticism. The repeated suggestion that reality is coming. The implication wasn't just about competition. It was about hierarchy. About reminding a newcomer where she stood. Even off the court, the pushback was visible. Attempts to downplay her records. To frame her success as a product of circumstance rather than talent. Corrections came later, quietly, but the message had already been delivered. This wasn't mentorship. It was gatekeeping. There was an unspoken belief that instant stardom had to be earned the hard way. That popularity without years of service somehow cheapened the grind. But professional sports don't operate on nostalgia. They operate on demand. And Clark represented a shift in how fans engage with the game. Younger audiences weren't tuning in because they'd followed the league for decades. They were tuning in because they connected with her style, her confidence, her range, and her story. Instead of celebrating that influx, parts of the culture treated it with suspicion. That mindset turned the league into a place where a rookie could be both the biggest draw and the most scrutinized presence on the floor. Every hard foul became symbolic. Every on-court interaction became evidence in a broader debate about respect and entitlement. The irony was impossible to miss. The league wanted growth but resisted the very thing driving it. Veterans wanted recognition but bristled when attention finally arrived through someone else. And that resentment created an environment where embracing the future felt optional, even risky. The Olympic decision didn't happen in a vacuum. It was the most visible outcome of a deeper struggle between protecting tradition and accepting evolution. And the longer that struggle continued, the harder it became to pretend it wasn't affecting everything else. As the season unfolded, the contradictions became harder to ignore. Caitlin Clark wasn't just carrying attention, she was absorbing contact. Night after night, defenses tested how physical they could be with her. Hard bumps away from the ball. Aggressive closeouts. Fouls that sent her sliding across the floor. Physical play is part of basketball. That wasn't the issue. The issue was how the league responded. There were moments when incidents involving Clark were initially brushed off as routine. Plays that looked excessive were downgraded. Whistles came late. Reviews took time. And only after clips went viral did the tone change. Only after millions of people reacted did consequences follow. That delay spoke volumes. It created the impression that the league was hesitant to step in. Not because the plays were ambiguous, but because protecting Clark too quickly might upset the balance. It might reinforce the idea that she was being treated differently. It might anger veterans who already felt she was receiving disproportionate attention. So the league hesitated. And in doing so, it sent a confusing message. On one hand, Clark was being marketed as a centerpiece of the league's future. On the other, she was being left exposed to prove she could handle it. As if resilience required unnecessary risk. As if earning respect meant absorbing punishment without immediate support. That inconsistency didn't go unnoticed by fans. It didn't go unnoticed by players. It fed into the growing sense that the league was unsure how to manage its own success story. Instead of clearly setting the standard, leadership appeared reactive. Decisions followed outrage rather than principle. Discipline followed headlines rather than precedent. And that reactive posture had consequences beyond one player. It reinforced the idea that popularity was something to be managed, not embraced. That stars were valuable until they disrupted the comfort of the system. That growth came with strings attached. For fans who had just discovered the league, this was their first impression of how business was done. And for many, it was jarring. The product on the court was compelling, but the governance felt uncertain. The more the league tried to walk the line, the more it appeared out of step with the moment it had finally been given. As the controversy grew louder, league leadership found itself trapped in its own messaging. On one hand, executives openly celebrated the surge in attention. Interviews were filled with optimistic language about growth, momentum, and a new chapter for women's basketball. Media rights deals were praised. Revenue projections were highlighted. The league finally had numbers it could brag about. And everyone knew where those numbers came from. Caitlin Clark's arrival coincided perfectly with the biggest financial upswing in league history. Broadcast partners paid more. Sponsors leaned in harder. Merchandise sales spiked. Games that once struggled for airtime were suddenly promoted aggressively. The league was being treated like a serious business for the first time in decades. Yet when it came time to showcase the player driving that surge on the world's biggest stage, the enthusiasm disappeared. That contradiction was impossible to sell. You can't call someone the engine of growth and then keep them off the track. You can't point to a rookie as proof the league has arrived and then act as if her presence is inconvenient when visibility is highest. You can't build leverage using her popularity and then distance yourself from it when things get uncomfortable. From a business standpoint, it made no sense. Sponsors invest in faces. Broadcasters invest in storylines. Casual viewers tune in for names they recognize. The Olympics are built around that logic. Every successful global sport understands this. The NBA didn't become international by hiding its stars. Soccer didn't expand by downplaying its icons. Stars aren't a distraction. They're the product. And yet, the league behaved as if spotlight management mattered more than market expansion. As if protecting internal balance was worth sacrificing external growth. As if stability was more valuable than scale. That mindset might make sense for a small organization protecting limited resources. It makes far less sense for a league claiming it's ready for prime time. The most revealing part wasn't what was said publicly. It was what wasn't said at all. There was no unified explanation. No aggressive defense of the decision. No clear vision communicated to fans or partners. Just silence, followed by carefully phrased statements that avoided the real issue. That silence allowed speculation to fill the gap. Viewers started asking why a league that finally had momentum seemed afraid of its own momentum. Why executives praised disruption while quietly resisting it. Why the benefits of Clark's popularity were embraced, but the responsibility that came with it was avoided. In trying to appear neutral, the league ended up looking uncertain. And uncertainty is poison in a moment that demands confidence. Because when opportunity finally knocks, hesitation is still an answer. Beyond basketball and business, there was another layer to the reaction that made the situation even more volatile. One that people hesitated to address directly, but constantly circled around. Culture, identity, and the uncomfortable conversations that emerge when rapid change collides with long-standing realities. Women's basketball has been built, sustained, and elevated primarily by Black women for decades. That history matters. It's foundational. And it shaped the league's identity long before mainstream attention arrived. Caitlin Clark's rise didn't erase that legacy, but it did complicate the narrative. Suddenly, a white rookie from Iowa became the most visible face of the sport. Media coverage followed her everywhere. Headlines centered on her performances. Casual fans who had never watched a full WNBA game began associating the league with one name. For some, that shift felt unsettling. Online debates flared up quickly. Questions about why this player received so much attention. Accusations that her popularity was driven by factors beyond basketball. Attempts to reduce her impact to marketing narratives rather than skill. These conversations spilled from social media into mainstream commentary. The league's response was muted. Instead of proactively framing Clark's rise as additive, as something that elevated everyone, leadership largely stepped back. They avoided taking ownership of the narrative. They didn't clearly position her alongside existing stars as part of a collective surge. And that vacuum allowed polarization to grow. What could have been a story about expansion became framed as competition. Clark versus the league. New fans versus old fans. Progress versus tradition. That framing benefited no one. By not addressing the tension directly, the league allowed outside voices to define it. Media personalities amplified conflict. Click-driven commentary turned nuance into outrage. And players found themselves pulled into debates they never volunteered for. The result was a culture war that distracted from the actual product. Instead of celebrating unprecedented interest, conversations revolved around resentment and division. Instead of uniting audiences, the moment fractured them. This wasn't inevitable. Other leagues have faced similar crossroads and chosen to lead the narrative instead of avoiding it. They acknowledged history while embracing new stars. They made it clear that growth doesn't replace legacy, it builds on it. Here, that leadership was missing. And in the absence of clarity, mistrust grew. Fans questioned motives. Players questioned intentions. The spotlight that could have lifted the entire league instead exposed unresolved tensions that had been simmering for years. By the time the Olympics ended, the damage wasn't just reputational. It was relational. And rebuilding that trust would require more than carefully worded statements. Once the Olympic spotlight faded, the league hoped the controversy would cool off on its own. That time would smooth things over. That winning gold would be enough to shift the conversation back to basketball. But that didn't happen. If anything, the aftermath made the decision look worse. Because the season picked up right where it left off. Caitlin Clark didn't regress. She didn't look overwhelmed. She didn't fade under the pressure everyone claimed she wasn't ready for. She elevated her game. Assist numbers climbed. Scoring efficiency improved. The Indiana Fever, a team that had been stuck near the bottom of the standings, suddenly became competitive, relevant, watched. And every strong performance reopened the same question. How was this player not one of the best 12 options in the country just weeks earlier? The contrast became impossible to defend. Analysts who had tried to stay neutral began acknowledging the obvious. The argument that she wouldn't have played much anyway fell apart as her on-court command became undeniable. The idea that she needed more seasoning collapsed as she consistently dictated games against veteran defenders. At the same time, ratings told an unfiltered story. Games featuring Clark continued to draw massive audiences. Games without her returned closer to traditional WNBA numbers. Not bad. Not embarrassing. But clearly different. The market was speaking in real time, and it wasn't subtle. Fans weren't confused anymore. They felt dismissed. They had invested emotionally and financially. They had followed the league because of Clark and stayed because they discovered other stars along the way. And now they felt like the people running the sport resented them for showing up late. For not having watched long enough. For changing the audience profile. That resentment came across in interviews. In commentary. In the way criticism was deflected rather than addressed. The message, intentional or not, was clear. Appreciation was conditional. And that's where trust broke. Because fans don't expect perfection. They expect honesty. They expect leadership to acknowledge when a moment was mishandled. Instead, they got defensiveness. Silence. Carefully neutral language that avoided accountability. Ironically, the Olympic snub didn't damage Caitlin Clark's image at all. It strengthened it. It cast her as the outsider. The player challenging a rigid system. The star succeeding despite resistance. That narrative is powerful. Every great sports icon has a moment where institutions doubt them. Where gatekeepers underestimate their impact. Where success feels earned not just on the court, but against the structure itself. Clark's exclusion became that moment. Meanwhile, the league was left explaining why its biggest opportunity had passed without the payoff everyone expected. Gold medals were won. But the cultural moment was lost. And moments like that don't come back on schedule. When everything is stripped down, this wasn't just about one tournament or one roster. It was a declaration of priorities. A statement, whether intentional or not, about what mattered more to the people in charge. They chose control over chaos. Familiarity over momentum. Hierarchy over evolution. USA basketball and league leadership were faced with a simple but uncomfortable choice. Embrace the disruption that comes with a generational star, or protect the structure that had existed before she arrived. They chose the structure. They chose to be right instead of bold. And that choice revealed a deeper truth. For all the talk about growth, the instinct was still defensive. The league behaved like a small operation guarding its corner rather than an expanding brand ready to dominate globally. It treated popularity as something to manage carefully instead of something to unleash. That mindset doesn't align with modern sports. The most successful leagues in the world understand that stars drive everything. They shape culture. They attract investment. They bring in new fans who eventually become lifelong supporters. Systems don't sell jerseys. Names do. By resisting that reality, the leadership signaled that stability mattered more than scale. That protecting internal balance was worth more than maximizing external impact. That tradition should not be challenged, even when the market is clearly asking for it. The irony is that none of this protected anyone. Veterans still faced scrutiny. Fans still voiced frustration. Media pressure didn't disappear. In fact, it intensified. The very backlash they feared became unavoidable, not because Clark was included, but because she wasn't. The decision didn't preserve harmony. It exposed insecurity. And now, the league finds itself in a position it can't talk its way out of. The audience has changed. Expectations have changed. The sport is being watched through a different lens, one that measures decisions not just by wins, but by vision. The next time a moment like this appears, and it will, the cost of hesitation will be even higher. Because once fans see what's possible, they don't forget it. They demand it. At this point, the debate isn't about whether Caitlin Clark will be fine. That part has already been answered. She's breaking records. She's driving ratings. She's turning a struggling franchise into must-watch television. Her influence is expanding beyond the league that employs her, and that kind of momentum doesn't disappear because of one snub. The real uncertainty hangs over the people running the sport. Because the Olympic decision didn't slow Clark down. It exposed leadership. It revealed how the league reacts when faced with change that doesn't ask for permission. And that reaction told fans everything they needed to know. This wasn't a miscalculation. It was a values test. When presented with a once-in-a-generation opportunity to globalize women's basketball, the choice was made to protect internal comfort rather than push boundaries. The hierarchy mattered more than the moment. The system mattered more than the surge. And fans noticed. They noticed when the explanations didn't line up with performance. They noticed when silence replaced clarity. They noticed when the league benefited financially from Clark's popularity while distancing itself from her visibility. They noticed when momentum was treated like a nuisance instead of a gift. That awareness changes the relationship between audience and institution. Trust doesn't break because of one decision. It breaks when people feel talked around instead of talked to. When leadership refuses to acknowledge what everyone can see. When actions contradict the message. The most striking part of this entire saga is the irony. By trying to minimize Caitlin Clark's impact, the league amplified it. By keeping her off the Olympic stage, they gave her a narrative that resonates far beyond basketball. The underdog. The disruptor. The player succeeding despite resistance. History favors those stories. And that leaves one unavoidable question hanging in the air, one that won't be answered by press conferences or carefully worded statements. Does the league need Caitlin Clark more than she needs the league? Because the market seems to have already decided. Ratings spike when she plays. Interest fades when she doesn't. New fans came for her and stayed for others, expanding the ecosystem the league claims it wants to grow. That's not coincidence. That's instruction. What happens next will define the future of women's basketball. Whether leadership adapts or doubles down. Whether it embraces stars or continues to fear them. Whether the next global opportunity is seized or quietly passed over again. The world is watching now. Not just the players on the court, but the people making the decisions behind it. And this time, there won't be another first impression. If you found this breakdown valuable and want more deep, analytical coverage of sports media decisions, league politics, and the business forces shaping modern basketball, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Subscribing helps signal to the algorithm that this kind of long-form analysis matters and allows the channel to keep producing content like this. If this video added context or challenged the way you saw the situation, hit the like button. It directly boosts reach and helps more viewers find thoughtful sports analysis instead of surface-level takes. And most importantly, leave a comment. Do you think the Olympic decision was about basketball, or was it about control? Should leagues always ride their biggest stars, or protect the system first? Your perspective drives future videos and shapes what we cover next. Thanks for watching. And this story is far from over.